Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Now, Davos, the World Economic Forum, is happening. And of course, there's one individual that is stealing the attention. You know who that is. It's none other than US President Donald Trump. Now, when it comes to South Africa, he has once again doubled down on his claims of this so-called white genocide against Afrikaners in South Africa, ramping up his rhetoric that this alleged persecution in a democratic country should be stopped. Now, everyone knows that the US and South Africa's diplomatic relations are at an all-time low, with the perception of race-based laws and the land expropriation without compensation. Trump has on many occasions said that there are bad things happening in the country over government's land reform policies. Joining me now to take this conversation forward, I'd like to welcome no stranger to us on Hilaal TV, Professor Patrick Bond, who is the Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Bond, assalamu alaikum. Always good having you on.
Alaikum salam. Very good to be with you, for us.
No, absolute pleasure. Professor Bond, I'm struggling to understand why this rhetoric from Donald Trump is going to ever change. But then again, why should we struggle to understand? He has made it his mission to go ahead and continue this rhetoric of the so-called white genocide.
It is extraordinary. And the main problem with it, of course, that it's a fib, but that it has another kind of underlying logic, which is to keep his MAGA racist base fed with that sort of red meat. Now, this is something we've seen so much of, in which if you want to distract attention from your own problems, well, you create some diversion, and the diversions are coming fast and furious. And it may be, especially with the incoming U.S. ambassador to South Africa, having himself embarrassed, I think, the traditions of the U.S., which are in the period since the late 1960s, to promote civil rights. And the incoming ambassador, who's a very, very well-known media activist for the far right, called Brent Bozell, has himself, in a sense, promoted that white genocide and the idea that Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress were terrorists for their one person, one vote liberation campaigning. And indeed, he was even asked at his October hearing in the Senate, his confirmation testimony, whether he supported black people having the vote, and he wouldn't say that he would. In other words, he was himself distracting from, I think, a long career on the far right in the US. So he's in his 70s, but he's looks like very aggressive. He's bringing to South Africa something that I think Trump will continue to play on, as well as the so-called white genocide, but that is South Africa against the genocidaires of Israel. That genocide against Gazans continues, and the top priority, according to Brent Bozell, given to him by Donald Trump as he was appointed in March last year, is to have South Africa withdraw from the International Court of Justice case. I think the more Trump digs himself into a hole on several geopolitical fronts, the less likely that is to happen.
You mentioned digging himself in a hole. And here's the thing, Professor Bond. The European Union, I mean, they obviously looked at what Trump's comments were and said, we'll take advantage of the sort of misplaced ideas that are happening in South Africa to strengthen its relationship with the country. And you can see that happening at this very moment, because with the European Union coming last year for the G20 summit, there you could see a sort of relationship developing between Pretoria and, of course, the European Union. Does this dig Trump into an even deeper hole, given his Greenland comments, which we are going to touch on in the next segment?
Yes, I mean, I'd like to think so, but in the last minutes, literally, we've seen the Trump concession, or taco, Trump always chickens out, on the invasion of Greenland. So we might as well mention it now, because it's just come across the wires that the NATO leader, Mark Rutte, former Netherlands Prime Minister, he obviously is a sort of Trump acolyte and wants to solve these problems without his institution completely falling apart, of which there's been quite a big risk if Trump did go ahead and invade Greenland. And what I understand is that the 1951 treaty that lets the US, which had taken over a lot of Greenland during World War II, particularly because, the German U-boats, the submarines, were a very serious threat to North Atlantic trade and the war effort. And Greenland and nearby Iceland had military presence from the US. And then in the Cold War, there was a very strong US military presence in Greenland. Since 1990, since the USSR dissolved in 1991, not so much, and there's just one base. But it looks like, from what we're just hearing, that Mark Rutte has invited a renegotiation. And given that Trump has gotten universal condemnation for threatening Greenland with an invasion, I suspect that's actually how this is going to play out, that the US will not only want to get more minerals, an expensive and difficult process from such a faraway and very cold terrain, but also that he'll be able to set up as many as 19 more US bases in Greenland. Of course, what Trump really wants is Trump land. He wants Greenland to be an extra 2 million square kilometers of US territory. He also wants that for Canada. It doesn't look like he's going to get either of those.
Yeah, we're going to touch on obviously Greenland and the Canadian Prime Minister's, a speech that was given at Davos yesterday. Professor, I guess from a South African perspective, and I want to come back to this, this quote of white genocide, there's only so much they can do. You can present Trump with the statistics, the official South African Police Service statistics, which show that there are murders happening in farms, but many of it is, of course, the black workers that are in the farms also that are being killed. So it's not really targeting supposed one race, and the stats back that. There's only so much, and to that question, there's only so much South Africa can do to tell Donald Trump, well, there is no such a thing called a white genocide. But then again, you have you've got lobby groups within the country that, of course, go to Washington and spin a story which would suggest that there is this white genocide that is happening. So they, and I'm speaking specifically on AfriForum and Solidarity, would say, well, we never use the words white genocide, but of course we're using stuff like land expropriation with compensation, and that would in turn, to Trump's mentality, mean that there's a genocide amongst the Afrikaner people happening.
Yes, I understand some of their concerns are the cultural weakening of Afrikaner control over state institutions, for example, public schools, monuments and things. So there are obviously some ways in which to get balance, to get a proper history of a crime against humanity, against Black South Africa by Afrikaner-led whites. Yeah, you have to actually begin to take away some of those privileges, and that's what they're looking for Donald Trump to be, a defense mechanism. And they realize, I'm sure, they've taken it way too far, and that the most important backlash is, in fact, against their own white farmers through the tariffs. Now, initially, those in August began to hit the citrus and the macadamia nuts of Limpopo or the Eastern Cape. But now those were exempted by October. And now it looks like there are major problems for Afrikaner farmers in the grapes and the wine, the vineyards are affected. So in a sense, the claim, okay, we'll get whites in as refugees. They'd hoped for several tens of thousands. I think it's still only in the hundreds who've applied, and they've had a difficult time. It's a very bad time to be working class in the U.S. I mean, even just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the U.S. basically, Trump pulled the subsidies from medical aids. And so that means for people having catastrophic health conditions, they're in very serious trouble. For the poor and working masses, already about 40 million people in that country affected out of the 335 million. But I think the crucial thing about it is that if you try for Afrikaner nationalism and minority protection, an Orania type of arrangement, plus cultural rights, and then you're also talking about the Western Cape breaking away, which another group of Afrikaners are, well, we're looking at a very arrogant and unrealistic group within the country of possibly 2.5 million Afrikaners. And I think from that standpoint, the Verlichte, the old liberal, the F.W. de Klerk and the people who cut the deal at the transition time are going to have to try to rein them in. I should add that I know also very well the Afrikaner Alternatiever, that is the progressive and countercultural crowd. They're very small. They had the Vrije Weekblad newspaper as an important site for you to look at them. But I think they're very, very upset by the fact that their own heritage is being besmirched by the far right and the Afrikaners.
The way we look at this scenario right now with this sort of white genocide comments, Professor Bond, you've got Brent Boswell III coming, and he's obviously continued this rhetoric. It's going to be a difficult time, is it, for Pretoria to really find a way to restore its relations with Washington? The South African government has really made it clear that they want to find a way to fix relations. And who knows what might be happening now at Davos to try and ensure that that happens. But when the rhetoric from Trump is quite clear, there is no meeting on the middle ground, is there, Professor Bond? And I've just been told we've got 2 minutes, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes to answer that, Prof.
Yes, in fact, I'd say the basic dilemma with Trump is you can't trust him, even if you do a deal, even if, for example, you go in May last year and offer a game of golf and some of the best courses. You have Gary Player as a friend of Trump, and in the House are the likes of Ernie Els or Johan Rupert. As much as you bend over as obsequious as Ramaphosa was, he couldn't persuade Trump even to come last November. And indeed, in December, it was clear that Trump said, no South Africans come to the G20. One of my colleagues, Baso Nzenze, professor of international relations, just wrote in Business Day, well, it's time for us to say to the rest of the world, have a G20 somewhere else. Don't go to Miami, to the Doral Country Club. I think that's a good way to look at it. I do worry that Parks Tau, our trade minister, and his ally, Dr. Alistair Reiters, a special advisor to President Ramaphosa, are still laboring under the false assumption that they can indeed go. And I think the main point about, since you mentioned Mark Carney, the Canadian, is that he was standing up in a way that I'd say was, it was two-faced. I mean, Canadians have a certain reputation for working with imperialism, but themselves as sub-imperial allies, but they certainly know how to talk. So he did a very good critique of the neoliberal imperial system while condemning Trump for the paleo-conservative destructive and the neoconservative grabbing, right, the militaristic side. So those three power ideologies. But then you actually look at the rest of his speech, and he says, actually, since my government took office, quote, we have cut taxes on incomes, capital gains, and business investment. We have removed all federal barriers
Professor Bond,
interprovincial trade.
Professor Bond,
So
I want to
two-faced.
continue that conversation on Mike Carney's comments, which he made yesterday, and that's where we're going to, of course, touch on. He's mentioned that the world must not be bullied by major powers, and of course, he was hinting heavily on Donald Trump, but will Trump still have this idea of annexing Greenland? My conversation with Professor Patrick Bond continues after the break. Welcome back to News in Focus. I'm still in conversation with Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. So, Professor Bond, obviously Canada's Mike Carney, mentioning that the world needs to adapt to the rupture caused by great powers. He also mentioned nostalgia is not a strategy. I guess we all know Canada and the United States are not seeing eye to eye on a lot of aspects. But you mentioned something there, a potential two-faced approach to this. In your view, was there a sense of sincerity that was delivered by Mike Carney?
Well, it is an extraordinary speech that Mark Carney gave to the Davos elites, because he did say something that I certainly agreed with, that the international law, I'm reading from his comments, his speech, applied with varying rigor, depending on the identity of the accused or the victim, on the values-based foreign policy. But he specifically says, quote, this fiction was useful, and American hegemony, in particular, helped provide open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. We participated in the rituals and largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. Now that's, end quote, that's an extraordinary confession that the Davos man, that the ideas of that World Economic Forum actually created the sort of monster that Donald Trump represents, and Trump was coming in the next day. But I just want to put this asterisk, because Mark Carney, like many Canadians, I must say, can talk left and walk right with the best of them, with the right likes of Robert Mugabe or Thabo Mbeki or Cyril Ramaphosa. So he says, quote, "Since my government took office, we have cut taxes on incomes, capital gains, and business investment. We've removed all federal barriers to interprovincial trade. We are fast-tracking $1 trillion of investment in energy," meaning the tar sands of that's very, very thick and dirty oil in the west part of the country, critical minerals, new trade corridors, and beyond. We're doubling our defense spending by 2030. We're doing so in ways that build our domestic industries. We're diversifying. We have a comprehensive strategic partnership with the European Union, including defense procurement and 12 other trade and security deals. In the past few days, we've concluded new strategic partnerships with China and Qatar, negotiating free trade pacts with India, ASEAN, Thailand, Philippines, Mercosur. What I'm saying, just quoting Mark Carney, is who used to be...
Well, Donald Trump's not going to be happy with that. You just mentioned China, the partnership with China. And Donald Trump is, of course, China, Iran, Russia. Those are the baddies in his eyes. So, I mean, that would upset Donald Trump more, won't it?
Yes, and Russia's not on that list.
Yeah, no, I'm just mentioning the three countries that Donald Trump sees as the baddies,
3 countries that were visiting Cape Town with their navies just last week, with all the controversies associated with that. So you're right. Trump sees Carney in a way more dangerously than his predecessor, Trudeau, because remember, Trudeau is called the governor, which means that already Trump thought that Canada could become a 51st state, just be swallowed by the U.S. Carney, on the other hand, who's about as suave, I was going to say he's formerly the central bank president in Canada, but then he was also chosen to be the Bank of England governor. So he became the top neoliberal for international finance, as seen through English-speaking eyes, along with, of course, the U.S. Fed chair. But that meant that when he did come to power last year, he had all the confidence of the financial markets. And in a sense, they have their voice through him. And he's a way to tell Trump, my people, financiers, Wall Street, or in his case, Toronto, the stock market, we don't like what you're doing. It's too dangerous. Now we're actually going to set up a new economy outside the terrain in which the U.S. grabs Canada as a little sub-imperial neighbor. And that would mean, for example, lots of Canadians refusing to buy U.S. bourbon, that sort of whiskey that they have in Tennessee, or delinking auto production systems from the U.S. parent companies, or, as you heard, that long list of free trade deals and security deals, and especially the deals with military relationships that Mark Carney's been setting up all over the world, and he was just in China. I can bet, though, he won't go to Russia, because the ideology of Canada and the European leaders is neoconservative. That is, they don't like Russia and the threat, and they probably would love to keep NATO intact, because it's the last gasp they have from Russia basically taking over all of Ukraine and moving further westward.
You mentioned NATO, Professor Bond. I want to quote Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark. She's called for constructive talks over Greenland. But here's the kicker: the respect for its territorial integrity. Now, here's my thing, Professor Bond. We can't see a way where President Donald Trump takes Greenland without compromising the sovereignty of Greenland. It becomes very difficult there. And I want to get your take with regards to the fragility right now of NATO, because if Donald Trump continues on this path, surely that sovereignty of Greenland goes out of the window, and hence, of course, the NATO agreement also kind of falls flat. How do you see this playing out, Prof. Bond?
Yes, I think what I had just mentioned, that the deals that seem to be underway now in Davos are between principals like Marco Rubio, the hardcore foreign minister, and the European Union, and especially Mark Rutte, the head of NATO. Those deals may allow Trump to claim to save face, to be able to put more military assets into Greenland. Don't forget, the U.S. has 820 different kinds of bases, mostly bases where their own troops are located all over the world. Number 2 would maybe be Russia, maybe China, but less than 10 each. And the point about that is that there's really no threat to Greenland from these other countries, at least at this stage. Trump is really just using his egocentric and maniacal desire to take the space, I think. And he will probably get some sort of offer from Mark Rutte, who is more friendly to him than now the rest of the EU leadership, and even including Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, who's been very obsequious with Trump. So that tension, it rose until Trump's speech. It was a terrible speech. It was, he didn't know the difference between Greenland, a huge chunk of land controlled by Denmark, and the independent country, the southeast island, a few 100 from Greenland, called Iceland. He mixed up Iceland and Greenland again and again. So I think people are saying, how do we humor him? How do we put a delay on it? Because aside from putting a few dozen troops, even Germans going now to Greenland, there's no way to defend that place, and only 56,000 people over that vast amount. So if Trump did want to invade, just like he did within Venezuela, he sent in troops on January 3rd, killed 120 local people and Cuban guards, and then spirited out Maduro. He might have the capacity to do that. What he's been trying to do, though, is to buy his way, like a sort of New York real estate developer, as he is. He wants to pay $500,000, which is, what is that, about 8 million rand or so to each resident of Iceland, to sort of buy them and say, no, if you vote for freedom, you get that 8 million rand. That's an extraordinary sort of insult, I think, to a nation, to a whole sense. And then the next big question, would the Greenland native people want to have formal independence? The sense is yes, but they'll do it slowly, since they do get a $500 million a year grant from Denmark as its colonial power. And so this remains to be seen what happens. But I do think now probably Trump's people are coming to their senses, because they see there's just universal opposition. And also in the U.S., there's only, I think, 5 or 10% of the people I saw in one of the polls who would support a military occupation and a sort of colonial takeover of Greenland. The way Venezuela, Trump thinks he's done the same to Venezuela, and it, by the way, is threatening still on Cuba and Colombia, Panama, Mexico. So I mean, it's a whole big mess, isn't it, of the ways in which Donald Trump is creating a fairy dust storm. And hopefully there's going to be more pushback, and deals won't be done, like Rutte probably wants to do, that are too favorable to Trump.
Prof. Bond, we've got about a minute, so I'm going to try and get this question in as quickly as possible. Trump has muted tariffs. Nobody knows if this is going to be a permanent solution. But who needs each other more? Does the European Union need the US, or the US need the European Union in terms of this relationship with regards to NATO? So we've got about just 45 seconds, Professor Bond.
Well, I think probably you're right to say, well, NATO is the crucial question, because it would destroy NATO if he did go ahead and invade. If he did also, we've heard from the Europeans, they will put on so-called bazooka sanctions against the US, and that would mean a variety. They already started sanctioning South African goods, exports of steel and aluminium to Europe, because of the high carbon content. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and they could easily do that to the US, since Trump has pulled out of the United Nations framework on climate change. Now, that means that we should all, I think, be talking about the sort of thing that worked with Elon Musk. Sanctions, boycott, divestment sanctions, working against Israel, fossil fuel companies. It worked against apartheid. I think South Africans should say, yeah, some sanctions against the US there would be timely right now.
Interesting to see how this is all going to play out. Professor Bond, always good to have you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be with you. Thank you.
That's Professor Patrick Bond, Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Jonathan Fowler from UNRWA. This as Israel has bulldozed buildings at the UNRWA facilities in East Jerusalem. UNRWA, an important aspect of delivering aid to Palestinian refugees, not just within the Middle East, but especially now in Gaza and the occupied parts of the West Bank. That conversation is after the break.